All right, friends, welcome back, or maybe I should welcome myself back because it's been 30 days since I've recorded. As you can see, the backdrop is different. I'm in the process of moving. This is the first of two moves that I have to do in the next few months. I just dragged the bookcase and the books with me just to have a sense of continuity here. But we're going to get on with the topic of Jupiter and the sign of Cancer today, Jupiter's exaltation. And it's a blessing to have Jupiter exalted for this next 12 months. I know I'm a little bit late in doing this video, but better late than never, considering that this is a long transit and it's going to last for 12 months. So let's get right into it. So first we got to look at, why is Jupiter exalted in the sign of Cancer? It's like, why would the planet that represents expansion, ethics, morality, teachers, in a sign that is so emotional and it represents her internal self or internal spaces? The sign of Cancer is about memory and protection. Why would it be exalted here? And to answer that, we have to move beyond just the key symbols of what Jupiter represents and what Cancer represents. And in a sense, this tells us something not just about the sign of Cancer or Jupiter, but what the core function of Jupiter is, that it comes to be in its exalted position in the sign of Cancer. And for that reason, in this video, we're going to discuss a little bit about the nature of Jupiter and the nature of Cancer and what it is about their synergy that when they come together, we get this exaltation. And before getting on to these points, if you like the content of this video or the content of this channel, please do remember to like, subscribe, and comment. And you know I love your comments. In fact, in the past 30 days, they kept me sane. Same with my readings, because we give so much significance to self-reflection. But when things get very intense in life, it's a blessing, talking about Jupiter's qualities, to be able to give your attention to someone else. So the readings that I did and the way that I was able to engage with you guys on the channel, I'm truly grateful for that. So leave your comments with your experiences with Jupiter and Cancer or the placements in your chart. And if you guys are interested in my reading or services, you can go to the description below for this video. I'll have the connection, the link there, or you can just go to parisayazdi.com. And all of that will be there as well. And without further ado, let us begin with this Jupiter and the sign of Cancer. So going back to Jupiter, and Jupiter's inherent function is about augmentation, that plus sign, positivity. It's talking about things exponentially growing, augmenting. And as I posed a question earlier, why does it get its exaltation in such an emotional sign? So let's briefly overview Jupiter and Cancer to understand this dynamic and this synergy that exists between them. So Jupiter on one hand is the principle of intrinsic augmentation. And if we're going to think about, well, how does Jupiter working with this getting bigger, we'd like to conceptualize Jupiter expanding things externally. But Jupiter in essence is expanding things from the interiority, and that expansion, it's giving the illusion of the external realm expanding. It's like having a balloon and blowing air into it. It's not that the balloon from the outside is getting bigger, it's because the content of the interiority of the balloon is getting bigger because there's adage of air. That's the reason why the balloon's getting bigger. So the function of Jupiter, it's actually like this. This is also one of the reasons why it's been said that Jupiter Ketu, South Node, that conjunction has a blessing in it, because Jupiter is functioning from internal spaces and augmenting things in that manner. So it's creating augmentation, coherence, and expansion from within. And this is the very reason why there is, like, Jupiter's represents to philosophy, morals, ethics. It's talking about a comprehensive system. It's talking about the coherence of a system. So when a system's growing internally, and from the external, it looks like it's expanding, that internal growth is maintaining the coherence of a system. It's not adding to contradictions, because it's bringing all the internal sets and subsets into relation to create something more comprehensive, which we can call that expansion, or something augmenting and getting bigger. So in a sense, Jupiter is representing the way a system evolves. It's talking about the evolution of a system. It's evolving in its scope and its complexity, and hence the kind of meaning that you can extract from that. So in a sense, Jupiter is about the act of incorporation. It's maintaining the unity of the whole system. Now, when we look at the sign of Cancer, on the other hand, we could conceptualize Cancer from an existential sense or from a personal sense as the internal inner spaces. You can actually think about it as a mode of something unfolding within itself. So it becomes a place of protection, engulfment, enclosures, and it's kind of about digesting life from inside out. Again, we can see that now that we're starting to see the commonalities. Jupiter is operationalizing everything and bringing everything to its greater sense of coherence from working from within, creating greater comprehensions. And the sign of Cancer represents that interiority itself. That's why the sign of Cancer is represented to our internal processing, such as our feelings. Our desires come from within, our emotions, memories. And it's through metabolizing these factors of the inner contents that we actually have a sense of selfhood, that we can make the statement of, I feel this way or I feel that way. So we can see when Jupiter enters the sign of Cancer, it enters a domain where its own motion and function is perfectly supported. In fact, Jupiter becomes nourished and protected by the sign of Cancer. So Jupiter can work at its most optimal level doing what Jupiter does. Hence, Jupiter is exalted. So I'm going to bring out some different points about clarifying why Jupiter is exalted, how it functions in the sign of Cancer, and when we come to very personal level experiences, how does this unfold? So this is how the rest of the video is going to go now. So as I just mentioned, the sign of Cancer creates a holding place for Jupiter and all of its functions. So this is something akin to saying that Jupiter actually needs some sort of an internal space in order to be functional. And the sign of Cancer provides it this internal within kind of a space. Because if you think about it, the sign of Cancer as a feminine principle is drawing everything within itself, right? So it's a space that draws external experiences inward and contains it. We can think of the sign of Cancer as that part of the system that can help to hold, integrate, and preserve. It's a space where complexity can be metabolized, digested. So it's extracting from the external environment, almost using it as a nourishment for this internal space. So the sign of Cancer is about that psychic and emotional interiority. It has a sense of rhythm to it. We've got to remember this is the moon sign, so that rhythmic fluctuating component is also going to be in Cancer. So when you put the sign of the planet Jupiter here, Jupiter is going to be expanding this internal space, this interiority, and it's going to get rooted very deeply. Whatever it is that Jupiter's trying to do, it's not superficial in the sign of Cancer. So we can say that Jupiter is going to do Jupiter things, which is to expand. But Cancer creates a field of containment for this expansion, which is actually expanding the system from within, not by external factors. So in a sense, the sign of Cancer is creating a very stable environment for Jupiter to do what Jupiter does. Because if you think about it, expansion without some sort of a containment can lead to a lot of chaos. I mean, there's a reason why in the astrological symbols, Saturn, the planet of restriction and negation, comes after the planet of expansion. It's almost like, dude, you're contained within this boundary. You cannot go outside of this. This is also why it's been said, like, for example, when Jupiter's conjunct Rahu, and let's say there's a tumor involved in the body, both of them are expressing something about Jupiter's about expansion, and then Rahu's about external moving. So everything becomes chaotic, out of control. But the sign of Cancer, it's keeping the operation of Jupiter, is containing it within an interiority. But then again, the sign of Cancer is a soft protective field. So it's allowing absorption. It's allowing expansion to occur because you need, whatever the inside is, you need enough flexibility and enough fluidity so that things can grow within without breaking the outer aspect of a thing. And another statement we can make about this placement is that Cancer has the capacity to nourish things, to nourish a system, let's say. Could be a family system, it could be an existential system, a cosmological system, just systems in general. And Jupiter has the capacity to enrich it. And we gotta remember, like, Jupiter has a bad rep, like Jupiter can just augment anything that it's sitting in. Well, that's a Jupiter that's dysfunctional, or that's a Jupiter that's maybe conjunct Rahu in a sign that doesn't support either of them. But Jupiter in its growth is looking for coherence. It's talking about a system that is ready to handle more variations, for example, or to incorporate more variations. And because Cancer gives it that internal space to do this. It gives it a foundation with coherence. So coherence can emerge out of this combination. All right, so now that we covered some of the basic about what sign of Cancer is, what does the planet Jupiter do, and what happens when they come together, we can actually start to talk about, okay, what can we expect when we have this combination? So one of the first things that we could say is that growth turns inwards and there's an expansion of all internal spaces. So in some ways, we can expect a shift from outward ambition, outward expansion of things, to things that are related more to inner cultivation, as an example. In some ways, we're not going to be pushing out there bullheadedly at any cost. It's like, do I have my internal self right before I'm keep pushing myself out there? It's got that kind of a feeling. In a lot of ways, through this transit of Jupiter in the sign of Cancer, we're invited to grow emotionally, to increase our depth of feeling, our emotional self-awareness, to expand the inner landscape that we have, where our values, desires, and private truths live. We're now coming to engage with these facets of the inner self. In a lot of ways, like measuring success by external attainment and achievement is not going to feel as good as it used to be. We want to make sure that internally there's a sound feeling about it, that there's resonance with the emotions. That's how we're inclined to judge and assess, let's say, our external success through this transit. It's kind of like a subtle evolution that's unfolding within us. I know for me, I have a great sense of this, especially with this move. There's been so many internal questions that the self is posing to the self in terms of evaluating external happenings to inner values, how they align, where there's resonance, where there's dissonance. I've learned more in the past 30 days than, to be honest with you, about a lot of things in the past few years. It's been incredible. And I think Saturn has a hand in this too. So yeah, it's a lot of touching base with how does the internal feel relative to what's happening externally. There's another thing that happens when Jupiter's in the sign of Cancer. Like one of its significations or what it can represent is emotional honesty. So it's about becoming more emotionally honest. And it's one of the hardest things to do because when we talk about self-deception, generally we're talking about this. We're either trying to create an emotion that's not true or to avoid a truthful emotion that actually hurts. And Jupiter will make us face things head on here to be able to resolve it, to be able to digest it in the sign of Cancer and eventually incorporate it into our experiential self, into our body self. You know, the sign of Cancer is ruled by the moon. The moon represents the body. So that somatic aspect of ourselves and the memories that it also contains, not just what's in the mind. So emotional honesty comes to be a prominent theme with this combination. And this is because one of the significations of Jupiter, or the things that it signifies, is about truth, trust, and honesty. But in the sign of Cancer, these take a different flair or a different way of processing. Like, for example, when Jupiter is going through the sign of Cancer, we're not going to be grappling so much with ideals and abstractions. It's more about emotional sincerity, emotionally being grounded, rooted. It's about being honest with how we actually feel about certain situation. Look at where the sign of Cancer is sitting in your chart. That house, that domain of life requires a lot of honesty now, sincerity. It's about honestly looking at oneself and being able to say, I really need that. That desire is actually fundamental to my well-being. And with this kind of an exaltation, with a benefic in a feminine sign, with a sign that represents memories because it's related to the moon, a lot of this emotional truth might be about processing the past, even past traumas, or coming to be more peaceful with the past's emotions, things that we have experienced, our memories in general, what's contained within. We might be trying to make peace with ourselves and our families because the sign of Cancer brings that notion into play, or at least places where we are very intimate and privately connected. And that very, the sign of Cancer is that internal space, right? So it's not talking about our relationship to the public. It's talking about the most intimate connections that we have. And one of the things this placement can say, I mean, this is supposed to be a feel-good conjunction or a placement, not a conjunction, a planetary placement. But a lot of times we very, very painful, we bury painful memories. So they might come to the surface because we actually need to deal with them, incorporate them into the totality of who and what we've become to be able to have a greater sense of coherence. And it's only when we do that that we can trust our hearts and the intuition that comes from it. So there can actually be some stirring with this kind of a placement, but it's only to digest it. It's to metabolize it and then to use it as a kind of a nutrition, something that makes us more sound, whole, cohesive, comprehensive. This is the blessing of Jupiter, and not all of it will just be fun and pleasant. Another thing we can see come out of this combination is that we can start to have a different kind of an ethic or value within our home and within our heart in general. And this is because Jupiter represents ethics, morality, and law. And these things generally pertain to society. So it's like, how does a self come into relation to society? But in the sign of Cancer, it's talking about something that's very private to us. It's personal. Like Jupiter can get involved in super grand debates about ideas, especially in terms of what's right and what's wrong. But in the sign of Cancer, it's going to be asking different kinds of questions. For example, it's not going to be uncommon for us to ask ourselves, well, what values am I living by in my life? What are my deep core values? Or what are the moral codes that I embody and I enact every day? Why do I do it? Where do they come from? We might be asking, if we're parents or teachers, like what kind of knowledge or what kind of morality and ethics am I passing on to other people in order to nurture and to protect them, for instance? Are they ethical? Is that an ethical way of protecting someone? These are the types of questions that may arise as self-inventory of looking at our internal self. Guys, I'm sweating here. It's like this location is so hot. It's that last place that I was in, there was better air circulation. So if you guys see me get all glossy and maybe even sweating, let's not sweat it. It is what it is. So yeah, we might see more ethical conversations too in the private spheres of our lives, like with our families, in our parenting practices. We're going to be thinking about emotional safety, for example, in relationships, because that's an ethical way of being, to make space for someone else, to allow them to feel what they want to feel and to feel protected. We can also start to grapple with questions of, okay, this group of people, this population, or these people within the family are vulnerable. What is the ethical way of dealing with this situation? What should be the laws? These are some questions that could arise. Like we look at, as I record this right now, talking about the last 30 days and its madness. Like one of the things that happened, I'm an Iranian, and that war between Israel, Iran, and then US getting involved. And I don't want to take political positions because, to be honest, this whole thing is such a hot mess on every front. And it makes me question how much of these politics actually has to do with ground experiences of human beings. You know, I look at Palestinian children and the Palestinian population who are just trying to live their own life. What's happened to them is unethical. You know, when I myself lived through Iran-Iraq war for 7 years, and the bombings every night, and that kind of fear, that kind of the lack of dignity that's there, the powerlessness that comes with that, it's unethical. So when we get this kind of a placement for the next year, these are going to be some of the questions. And not ethical in an abstract way, but ethical in a very private and an emotional way, the way that we actually connect with people in a personal way, the way that we actually feel personally. So these are going to be some of the topics that are going to be coming up this year. Like, how do we protect the most vulnerable populations? How do we care for them? How do we nurture them? Yeah, these are some of the things that could come up with this kind of placement. So this creates very strong possibility that cultural values, laws in themselves are going to be pushed to go through some sort of a metamorphosis, a growth, a maturation, a kind of an evolution regarding such populations or having domestic concerns. If we get more economic problems, for example, my brain's totally starting to swing that way. We're going to be asking, like, that's our domestic concern, right? We need to nurture our families. We need to be nurtured, and we're feeling vulnerable. What are the ethical ways of doing things? We could be discussing through this transit. We might see on the headlines, parental rights, for example, childcare, and emotional protection in both public and the private spheres of life. not going to another kind of meaning we can extract from this. This is our fourth point now. We can see emergence of inner optimism and considering, for example, how Jupiter is squaring Saturn right now. So Jupiter is bringing blessing and Saturn is bringing bad luck, right? So that sense of Jupiter's optimism relative to, let's say, what's happening with Saturn or such aspects that are going to come up in the next year or 11 months now, that optimism comes to be about a kind of an inner resilience. And we usually think of Cancer as being super soft, but think about the animal that represents it. It's the crab, right? That hard exoskeleton that it has. It's a hard exterior that's protecting the inner mushy self. You know, there's a sense of external resiliency that's protecting the inner vulnerability. And Jupiter coming here, that optimism of Jupiter can actually become something that is about our resilience. And we also have to remember Jupiter represents trust, faith, and of course, optimism, positivity from a psychological perspective. So in the sign of Cancer is going to help us to relocate those attitudes within ourselves, especially I think where it's most significant on a personal level, not only within our mind and our emotions, but also within our own body. Because some of, let's say, some people's greatest health anxieties come from the fact that they don't trust their own body. There's always a sense of doubt. What if something's going wrong? What if something's deficient? And to have that ability to have a good internal self and have a sense of inner trust is a very important thing to have in this life. And in a lot of ways in this year, faith is not going to be about external assurances. It's kind of a quiet inner trust that can even say to itself, if no one else can see it, if no one's a witness to it, I still believe in the worth of what I'm carrying. I trust in what I'm feeling. I trust my intuition. These are very important things in this life to help us feel grounded within ourselves and within our lives. So in a sense, this is a year of cultivating emotional optimism and considering, people, when I talk to them on individual basis, everyone has their own personal burdens, pains, things that they're negotiating and dealing with. And then we look at the external world and its climate at the moment. There's a lot of hardship there too. It's hard to be emotionally optimistic. Pessimism, skepticism, cynicism, these are Saturn's signification, and Saturn's debilitated, so it's bringing it fully to the forefront. Jupiter's mitigating this. It's helping us to cope and to deal and to have a sense of trust in life in general. And it's this kind of optimism and trust that actually allows us to grow and mature up as a human being. We're not just reactive. We can become proactive in life. This is the blessing of Jupiter in Cancer. So private growth becomes something very significant. And then when you look back, by the time this transit's over, usually it's very hard to measure internal growth until another crisis in life hits. And then you watch yourself and how you're dealing with it. You're like, wow, I've actually grown a lot. But I think by the end of this year, it's something that we can actually evaluate, especially because Saturn's going to be squaring that from Aries. Aries is going to be squaring the sign of Cancer with these two planets there. We're going to get a few months of break, and they're going to actually make a trine when Saturn moves into the sign of Pisces. But I'll talk about all of that in the upcoming videos. But we can talk about measurable internal growth that we're able to see by the end of the year. And on the fifth point, I want to talk about this concept of return to domestic spirituality, for lack of a better word. And what I'm trying to talk about here is about private wisdom. And we got to remember Jupiter represents religion, philosophy, and in general, wisdom traditions. When Jupiter comes into the sign of Cancer, we can say that these ideas coming from institutions or as institutionalized expressions start to take more of a private expression. They become domestic. They become part of our everyday lived experiences. So in this way, when Jupiter comes into the sign of Cancer, we might find ourselves being more inclined to have private rituals, practices. You might feel inclined to even make a household altar as a place of worship, meditation. There can be a sense that you need to venerate the ancestors. And they're generally spiritual practices that are centered around care. It's about nurturing and establishing emotional connections, but in a very private manner, within the private spheres of our lives. So they're not declared, you're not ceremoniously, publicly doing these kinds of rituals. This very hidden practice within the heart. It can be very devotional. In a lot of ways, philosophy itself, whatever philosophies we hold or have, become less theoretical and more like quiet wisdom that just lives and breathes inside of us. It's like the kind of wisdom that lives in the kitchen when you're cooking, or the kind of private wisdom that's being imparted in telling your children or your child a bedtime story. It's a subtle, quiet wisdom. When someone's upset, just by placing your hand on someone's shoulder, you're imparting that kind of a care and that kind of a wisdom in a very subtle way. Jupiter in Cancer can have that feeling. And there's a lot of warmth and lovingness that can come with it. Jupiter is the greatest benefic, right? So we're talking about that which makes us feel good and whole. And this year is actually a very good time for all of us to contemplate and try to feel, sense what is sacredness to us, what is sacred within our lives. And not to find it in temples and texts per se, but in the rituals of living every day. Like, we don't realize how sacred the spaces that we occupy are, the objects of the world that we're even surrounded with. There's sacredness in them. If we have animal friends, our friends, everything that we're engaged with, there's a sense of sacredness within it. So this is a time to actually start to feel these kinds of things. And it requires feelings, not things you think through. So it's lending your internal self to different components of everyday rituals and practices. The way that we enter somewhere through a doorway, looking at that archway and understanding what an entrance and an exit is. So these become something that we can cultivate and nourish through the transit of Jupiter in the sign of Cancer. And for some people, it will come to them more naturally. Other people have to become more conscientious of these things to actually practice the act of becoming aware of this. And ultimately, what this sacredness is about, being able to have a heart that can be devotional. This is probably the highest expression of what it means to have an internal self. Is it devotional? Because if it is, it's constructive, it's life promoting, it's life holding, it's life preserving. When there can be no devotion, it is very easy to be destructive and destroy everything. So Jupiter in Cancer can make us aware of these kinds of things. And on to our 6 points. Oh, I need to adjust myself. I'm so not used to, like, I can hear myself right now talking because it has a different kind of an echo. There's a dog barking, which I could never hear from the 14th floor of the other place. I see people walking on the street because I'm on a street level. Yeah, the whole thing is just my brain's juggling like 3 million things by point 6. But let us move through this. On this point, we can start to focus on the role of teachers, parents, gurus, caregivers, nurturers, growers of any kind, because Jupiter symbolizes such people. And considering this is the exaltation of Jupiter, this transit is saying that Jupiter is going to elevate the role of such figures, and especially the emotional role that they play in our lives. For instance, even on a cultural level, we can have elevation of such figures. For example, acknowledging the emotional labor of parents, something that, especially since women have been the caregivers of children for so long, this aspect of their labor has always been invisible. So with Jupiter in the sign of Cancer, credit could be given where credit's due. Or we can start to place more emphasis on the nurturing aspect of education, not just that we're getting these people trained and ready for the workforce. There's more to education than that. We can also be talking about the spiritual authority of those people who can hold a space for others to feel safe. So we can get these kinds of meaning coming out of Jupiter in the sign of Cancer. I don't know, I feel like I need to explain this a little bit more, like showing great respect for mothers, caregivers, and teachers. That could become a motto in today's culture and in the next year with this transit. Or rethinking, how do we actually educate children, especially emotionally? What are we cultivating within them? What are we configuring here? We can actually have public figures who will come forth and speak from a place of emotional intelligence That's their authority, not just authority of the intellect. So in a sense, these individuals become vessels of emotional guidance. They become those people who help others to grow. They become the growers, and not just in knowledge, but in emotional maturity. Honestly, if one does not have emotional maturity, knowledge can be a dangerous thing. I mean, being dogmatic, one of the reasons is this. You don't have emotional maturity, for example, to hold two thoughts simultaneously, to have full on feeling regarding both of them, but understand that you don't have to be reactive, that you don't have to over exaggerate. Now, let's move on to the seventh signification that can come out of this combination, which is about goodness and good fortune. But we got to realize in the sign of Cancer, goodness and fortune will require emotional integrity. So if anyone's sitting there and thinking, well, Jupiter represents good luck and success, and it's exalted in the sign of Cancer, therefore I should have it. Not necessarily. And I've read enough charts to see Jupiter in the sign of Cancer in that chart where the person feels unlucky. They don't feel like they're actually fortunate or successful. And I think a lot of that has to do with, have we cultivated emotional integrity? Do we have the right perspective? Do we make space to feel the right things? That comes with maturity again, that emotional maturity. For example, success in the sign of Cancer with Jupiter there can look like feeling safe inside your own skin, your own body, in your own mind, in your own thoughts, and how you just exist within. A lot of people don't feel safe. A lot of anxiety comes from not being able to trust what you're going to be thinking about next. It's not even about what's going to happen to you externally, but rather the mind generating that thought and unpredictably, and you just can't trust what's going to come up. So there's always a sense of anxiety about how you're going to be feeling inside yourself. But Jupiter here is allowing us to understand what it means to actually feel safe within and feeling a sense of trust in our most inner and intimate circle. And in general, having a life that reflects our deepest values, even when they're quiet and unassuming, especially when they're quiet and unassuming. We don't realize how much of those quiet and unassuming values are determining so many of our decisions, emotions, what we think about, what we desire, what we actually need. So Jupiter is about evolution, refinement, and cultivation of these aspects of the inner self. And when we have that, that's when we feel like we're fortunate. That's when we have a sense of success. We always want to measure success objectively, but a lot of times it's subjective. That's what truly matters when you're on your deathbed. What did you feel about your life? Not how others assessed it objectively, externally, because they're measuring you relative to some other standard. But did you meet your own standard? That's the inner value, right? That's often subtle and quiet. So in a lot of ways, when Jupiter's in the sign of Cancer, goodness can take on the shape of what it means to be in a safe place amongst others who are close to us. And what does it mean for us to be a safe figure, for others to be with us? And with Jupiter in Cancer, fortune isn't about gambling for some kind of an outcome, like the way Mars would do it. Risk it all. Take a chance. Just go do it. Jupiter in the sign of Cancer is demanding of us to have a life structure that permits continuity. I mean, when you think about it, this is the way to dissolve trauma, because trauma is something that happened to you that in that instance of its happening, you could not fit it in the entirety of your narrative. It's sticking out like a gush of something, a sore spot that just can't be incorporated in it. So the notion of goodness and success when Jupiter comes into the sign of Cancer is about, can we incorporate? Can we create a sense of continuity in our narrative and in our sense of self? That's what makes us feel like we've been healed. That's the way to feel nurtured. So this is some of the blessings of and the good fortune that Jupiter brings into the sign of Cancer. And our eighth and last point, and we can make so many points, but got to draw the line somewhere. Jupiter has a lot to do with generosity and charity. And I think being generous and charitable is a theme through this transit, especially in the sign of Cancer, which is talking about emotional generosity. You know, even if you give, let's say you're financially generous, But if the emotions, which are determining the intent of why you're being externally generous, it's an important factor. Like, am I being generous because I'm just trying to save some tax dollars, or am I emotionally generous and I actually want to give and to create goodness for someone else? Like, very mundane examples of this is that someone comes to you, a friend or a family member, and they ask you for a place to stay. But do you open your home to someone to actually provide them something, to take care of them for a while, to meet their need? Or are you doing it because, let's say, you expect something in return? You know, Jupiter's intent, that kind of generosity that Jupiter has in the sign of Cancer, just to meet their needs genuinely, because that's what they need in the moment. It's generosity without strings attached. It's about giving and receiving emotional support that's genuine, or it's about giving without asking to be seen. You know, the sign of Cancer is very private, so it's not about big announcements. You literally have to have that big space within to be able, you also have to have a sense of fullness to be able to give generously. So Jupiter is either going to create that fullness so that our cup is full, therefore we can give to someone else, or it's going to be about, okay, if your cup is full, you might get a friend who will knock on your door because you're supposed to be generous throughout this next 11 months left. So it's about nurturing without demands. That's the generosity of Jupiter in the sign of Cancer. It's about giving from the overflow of emotional sufficiency. So I'll leave it here for now. I'm going to keep coming back to this because this outline that I'm looking at, the writing for it includes a lot of other topics, but I just wanted to keep this one short and concise to get through the video, to be able to share something with you guys, especially after so much time has passed and I have not done any transit videos, and for me to get acclimated to this new environment. So let's just do a quick conclusion for this, which is to just quickly go over what we can expect, overview of this transit. I think one thing to keep in mind, this transit, even if it's occurring in your 10th house, at its core, is not about expansion in the public realm. I want you to think about this. Jupiter is debilitated in the sign of Capricorn, and I don't want us to conflate the signs with the houses, but the natural zodiac fits in the 10th house, right? Is the most public sector of our charts. And Jupiter is debilitated in the sign of Capricorn. So Jupiter needs those internal spaces. Jupiter is not about the ambitious public out there kind of a vibe, and especially in the sign of Cancer. It's about growth through maturing emotionally. It's about expansion and growth through inner coherence. It's about wisdom that's not loud, but it's embodied. It's about wisdom that's deeply felt. It's shared quietly. It's about creating spaces where life can flourish, and it's allowed to grow from within, not superficially, not artificially by expanding its external shell and its external self, but incrementally growing from the internal so that we have a full inner self that's actually has expanded over time and has grown. It's growth from within. And we got to remember, Jupiter is trying to create inner truth. And if we have inner truth, we are living in abundance. We always want to measure wealth in terms of the material components of life. But the wealthiest person is a person who has a big heart, for example, is a person who has a full inner self. That person's truly joyous. That jubilance that's related to Jupiter truly belongs to a person like that. And Jupiter in the sign of Cancer is about the cultivation of that aspect of ourselves, a full inner self that has a continuity, that it's comprehensive, feels whole, integrated, where truth itself becomes grounded in abundance. Truth itself becomes the abundance. And when we have truth as our internal state, our feelings, which can often deceive us, can become a path to wisdom. I always say this to friends and clients. Don't believe every emotion you have until you know it's a truthful emotion, because emotions will deceive us if they're not coming from a place of abundance, fullness, truthfulness. But once when they are our deepest and greatest wisdom. And one thing that Jupiter will do, look, it's very hard to feel like you're growing when there's a lack of safety, when your primary needs are not met. And the sign of Cancer represents the things that we need. It represents what we desire, but what we desire also comes from our subjective evaluation of the things that we need and the objective needs that we need for our survival. So if you don't have those things, it's very hard to grow. But what Jupiter is trying to do in the sign of Cancer is to show us how we are actually safe, where we are safe, how we can feel safe. And it's that permits us to grow, to become embodied, to embody our own truth, and to be the embodiment of that which we now act in the world. This is a year for that. And don't get this idea of feeling safe so that you can grow, that safety has to look the way you think it should look. Sometimes certain wisdom gets transmitted to us or unfolds within us that lets us see the ways that we are safe that we could never conceptualize before. And I would make a suggestion to allow some space and some room for things that don't necessarily feel safe to reveal themselves in terms of the ways that you are safe. I'll make a video and actually talk about this at another point, but I'll leave it there for now. And if this video spoke to you guys, or if it's of anything that is of value to you, talk so much about values today, please leave a comment, share, subscribe, like. And as always, you can explore my readings at parisayazi.com or just contact me with the email link below. And we'll wrap it up here for Jupiter in the sign of Cancer. I hope it is a blessed one for you. And I look forward to all of our growth and what comes of this transit. That's it for now. Much love. Until next time.